Okay, so this lecture is going to be on the Enlightenment, otherwise known as the Age of Reason or the Age of Revolution. This is a lecture that I've had to put an extra amount of thought into. I've given this lecture many times, but with recent events in North County, in terms of the unrest there, some of this is very relevant, and I want to phrase everything and discuss everything in ways in which you, the student, can form your own perspective based upon your own values and experiences, by giving you knowledge, hopefully in an unbiased way, as much as possible. So it's taken me a significant amount of time to get around to recording this, just to make sure that I'm very careful about what I say, that this is helpful for each student during this period of time in which there's this period of unrest in the St. Louis County, and in light of the issues that are on everybody's minds at present. Okay, so we're talking about the Enlightenment, and in the Enlightenment there are two big principles that we're going to discuss, or two principles, or two aspects of the Enlightenment that are most important for our study, our examination. And one is that human beings begin to use reason in an attempt to understand observed experience. And they do this rather than appealing to traditional authorities. In the past, people would appeal to Scripture or to natural law, excuse me, not natural law, or to church tradition, in order to arrive at absolute truth. In this period, people will begin to trust the senses, the observations that come from the senses, and attempt to use reason in order to order and comprehend those observations. Secondly, because this is the observance of natural law in the minds of thinkers, there is an attempt to apply natural law, the laws of nature, to human political systems. And what results out of that philosophical movement is a period in which, around the world, many different peoples in North America, South America, and Europe particularly, attempt to wrest power away from monarchs and systems of monarchy, and to set up representative democracies in the form of republics. To really get at that, to understand just how this process got started, we have to look at absolutism. And I'd like for you to take a look at the video, John Adams Meets King Louis XVI of France. And this is an important video because it demonstrates the power of the king. You notice that people are kneeling, they're kissing the king's hand. John Adams is there as a representative of the rebellious 13 colonies, the new nation of the United States of America, trying to secure aid. He's there with his friend and co-revolutionary Benjamin Franklin. Louis XVI is what will be the last in a long series of absolute monarchs. And France in this period of time was governed by a system called absolutism. The 30 Years' War in Europe, in the previous century, from the one we're talking about, there was a period of Protestant and Catholic conflict. There was this massive religious conflict that raged throughout Europe, and it was very destructive. Around a third of the population of Germany died in this conflict. Germany was kind of the battleground in that you had northeastern Germany that was primarily Lutheran, Protestant, Western Germany, which was primarily Catholic, and Bavaria in southern Germany that was primarily Catholic. So the split in terms of religion in Germany made Germany the front lines for the different Catholic powers of Europe to battle one another. Sweden kind of held the banner for Protestant countries. During that period of time, Sweden was a great power, one of the most powerful nations in Europe or the world at the time. And Spain was the predominant Catholic power, followed by France. So this period of religious conflict, what this meant is that religious institutions lost a great amount of prestige. Now, people are still, by and large, very religious relative to our modern society, but in the realm of politics, the excesses of what would later become known as religious fanaticism, this was something that was on the minds of Europeans in the 18th century, the century after the 30 Years' War. They began to look back at their forebears and say, well, some of these horrors were enacted in the name of religion. We need to limit the power of religious institutions. We need to order our political systems around national sovereignty. And that is it comes from the Latin word natio, which means kind of an ethnic group, a nation. Right? So the French have a nation, the British have the English have a nation, the Germans have a nation. Right? In this thinking, in this way of thinking, and these nations are organic. They're not the result of. They're not a human construct. They come from nature, where you have people of a similar ethnic group and linguistic group speaking the same language and the same values. They coalesce and form a larger body, kind of an extended family of extended families. And that, again, just as an aside, that's what makes the United States unique in this period of time, in that the American founding fathers were forming what we might call an idea nation. It's a nation based on principles, on political principles, those of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and constitutional rule, rather than any one ethnic group, any one ethnic identity. So, religious institutions began to be subordinated to the will of these nation states, as they would come to be known. And the nation states were headed by monarchs, by kings and queens. And these kings and queens began to take a great amount of political power unto themselves. Previously in the Middle Ages, the kings and queens of Europe had been limited, their power was limited in scope due to the presence of a very powerful international church headed by the papacy, the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, and this limited their authority. Over time, they began to take more and more authority away from the church, more and more authority away from merchants, more and more authority away from the nobles living under them, their own subordinates, and amassing more and more centralized control under the kings and queens. We call this system absolutism, a system in which a system of government in which a monarch has unlimited power. And these monarchs claimed to rule by divine right. They claimed that God had ordained the king, the queen, queen, and remember this idea of the great chain of being, and thus they derived their power from divine will. So the king has a duty to make sure that the right religion is being taught in his domain. Also, the people have to obey him because he's chosen of God. Okay, this is the result. This is an ideological outgrowth of these kings and queens taking the power of religious institutions unto themselves. They can now justify their power by emphasizing divine right. Okay, the epitome of divine right, the most classic, most exemplary absolute monarch is Louis XIV, the predecessor of Louis XVI, the young king we saw in the video meeting John Adams and Benjamin Franklin. Louis XIV was an absolutist in every sense. There had been threats to his authority when he was very young. And so when he came into majority, he became a mature man. He sought to limit the power of the nobility under him in every way possible. And you can see these long flowing robes. They have the fleur-de-lis, the symbol of the French monarchy, and of course they're blue, the color of the French monarchy. He's got this jewel-encrusted sword symbolizing his kingship. He's got this large wig on to prevent any, if he comes down with lice, his lice will be unnoticeable. And you notice that he's got these kind of, these rocking calves here. He's doing calf raises or whatever, apparently. He's got these tights on and these pink buckled shoes at the bottom, pink being a color associated with masculinity and military prowess at the time. Louis XIV had taken his grandfather's hunting lodge in the countryside outside of Paris, called Versailles, and he turned that hunting lodge into a huge complex. And this would be like as if the president were to take Martha's Vineyard and turn it into this massive just resort. And he relocated the government outside of Paris to Versailles in order to distance himself and distance the government from the city of Paris, all of the nobles in the city of Paris, all of the different the different politicians in Paris, wealthy members of society, etc. And not only did he construct this absolutely outrageous palace complex, he forced the nobility to actually pay for a large portion of it. And then he forced many of them to live at this huge palace complex so that he could maintain authority over them. And of course, they would pay him gifts. They would give him gifts and strive to earn his favor so that they could eat with him, so that they could watch him as he slept, so that they could watch him as he spent time with his many mistresses. In fact, I'm including a video about both Versailles and Louis's mistresses in this discussion. So if you want to go ahead and take a good look at those, now would be a good time. So Louis was so powerful and he was so admired throughout Europe as the king's king that he was imitated throughout the continent. For example, the King of Prussia, which is even though it sounds like Russia, it's actually Eastern Germany, a portion of Eastern Germany. The King of Prussia, Frederick William, he was in love with his wife. He treasured his wife, but because he wanted to be like Louis XIV, he actually faked having an affair. He faked having a mistress so that he could imitate better Louis XIV, which shows just how much he was setting the trends of his era. He didn't become Protestant. He did not like what he had seen in Protestant countries such as Britain, England, and Scotland, then under one crown, under one ruler. He believed that Protestantism, particularly in the Netherlands, where an actual republic had been founded with no king, he believed that Protestantism could lead to less power for the king or queen, that it tended towards representative rule. Furthermore, even though he did not become Protestant, he also attempted to limit the power of the Pope in his realm, to abrogate power unto himself, to take some of the church's power away, even though he remained Catholic. He revoked a document called the Edict of Nantes. This had been signed in an earlier generation. It had secured toleration of French Calvinist Protestants. So you have a Protestant minority in France of Calvinists, Presbyterians. Basically, as we use the term Presbyterian. That comes from the Presbyterian Church in Scotland. Presbyterian is kind of the Scottish term for Calvinists, so that's what we use in the United States, generally speaking. There was a document, the Edict of Nantes, that had secured the rights of French Calvinist Protestants to practice their religion in their own homes, in private. Okay, they couldn't proselytize, but they could, in the privacy of their own homes, practice their religion. He picked up the Edict of Nantes and he said, "I am the state," meaning that he was the law. His word was law, and he could do whatever he wanted to do. And he actually physically ripped up this document, taking the rights of worship away from these French Protestants. And of course, when he said, "I am the state," and ripped up this document, that's the equivalent of the president striking the First Amendment out of or ripping that off of the the U.S. Constitution. It is a sign, an action that symbolized his absolute power. And he fought nearly every other major power in Europe, and through warfare he enlarged France's borders. He ended up putting his grandson on the throne of Spain, and he became the preeminent power in Europe. Now, how could we justify, why did people put up with Louis taking this power upon himself? Why did people think that it was so great to have a king with all of this absolute authority? This was very much in keeping with the political culture and thought at the time. The century before, there had been the chaos of the 30 Years' War. There had been all this destruction. There had been looting. There had been large-scale rapes. There had been civil strife. There had been civil war. Armies had marched across Germany, trampling crops, killing livestock, killing peasants on both sides. And so, in the aftermath, political thinkers began to glorify the strong man, the strong ruler. Okay, this is the strong ruler who can keep everyone in line. And one of these theorists, Thomas Hobbes, is very important for later political development. Thomas Hobbes believed in something called the social contract, and that is that when we're born into what's called a state of nature. The state of nature is just human beings without culture, without knowledge, without rules, doing what they want to do when they want to do it. Kind of an anarchic way of being, living according to our primal nature. And we live in this state of nature, but we can't benefit from civilization while we're living in this state of nature. Okay, so for example, we can't farm, we can't start a business, we can't build up any private property if someone can just come over, hit us over the head with a club and take it, right? It's not the way to produce a prosperous, secure society. So Hobbes argued that in order to live in a civilized society, we have to give up some of our freedoms. We yield some of that freedom to the state. Okay? We yield some freedom in exchange for security. And the state takes some of those freedoms upon itself, and then it provides us with security. Hobbes believed that the state of nature was brutish. The state of humanity before the advent of rational government was one of brutality, of kind of a primitive way of living. Human beings without the presence of authority and the coercion of authority, human beings will revert to raping and murdering one another. That's how Hobbes saw human nature. This is Hobbes' viewpoint. And so Hobbes believed that a strong human being had a strong ruler, a strong king had to be, a strong king was necessary to control human beings, because human beings are so inherently evil. Human beings are inherently evil. There are many of them in society. The king, therefore, has to have a lot of power in order to control this great mass of people, to keep them in line. Right? It's if you've ever seen the shows, I think it's is it on A&E? I can't remember. I used to watch them all the time. Scared Straight, I think is the name of it. Beyond Scared Straight. in which they take children from children who are kind of making bad decisions, not really knowing the consequences of their decisions, and they take them into to visit jails, county jails, and they see, you know, just how horrible these places are, and this is supposed to shock them into behaving better. And of course, this is kind of a public service that's done by these sheriff's departments around the country in order to prevent crime, to prevent a lot of human misery. But this kind of drastic approach is seen as necessary for those children who are, you know, are heading in that direction, are kind of barreling towards barreling towards a lot of misery and suffering themselves. And you know, of course, this is something that I myself experienced at one point in time when I was a teenager. But we won't talk about that. But this is how Hobbes saw human nature. Human nature had to have strong controls on it. Otherwise, if left to our own devices, we would destroy civilization. An example I give is after Hurricane Katrina. I think I've already mentioned that I'm from Mississippi. There was a period where I lived in South Mississippi. The town that I lived in, Hattiesburg, had been ravaged by Hurricane Katrina, and the National Guard had been called in. The night before the hurricane hit the Mississippi Gulf Coast, the governor, Haley Barbour, got on the radio and he said, the National Guard's going to come in. If you loot, you're going to be shot. And this was it was a very, very intense statement, right? And it was kind of it made me think just how serious, you know, it was kind of terrifying to me, because I thought, well, what is going to happen? You know, this storm, is it that massive? Could it cause this much damage? And of course, it hit the Mississippi Gulf Coast, and when the governor went to see the Gulf Coast, he said that it looked as if an atomic weapon had been dropped in the Biloxi and Gulfport, these other towns. But the National Guard came in and began to, and martial law was imposed. There was no electricity. It really was a pain not having electricity for that long. Of course, many people had much worse problems, their property being destroyed, etc. But there was a man in the town that I lived in, Hattiesburg. He killed his sister for a bag of ice. And you think about that, you know, his whole life changed. His family changed forever, just for a bag of ice, because people were in such desperate straits. They had lost, many people had lost control, right? And this is, out in the country. This is in a rural environment, very different from that kind of captivated the nation in New Orleans. But still, this state of nature this analogy worked there. There was chaos in Mississippi, just as in New Orleans. But Hobbes would look at that as a perfect example of this reversion to the state of nature, that the state of nature is brutal. Therefore, the National Guard was justified in coming in and imposing martial law and taking away liberty. Because if you don't have that, more people will kill others for a bag of ice. Right? Okay, so just to return to just a refresher about the general principles of the Enlightenment, the Age of Revolution, or the Age of Reason, really quickly. Again, our first aspect is rationalism, discovering truth through the use of reason, right? Using our observation, observing the world around us, and using our reason to kind of deduce principles based on that observation, instead of appealing to authority, instead of appealing to the church or church tradition, or the use of scripture, or the ancient authorities like Aristotle, Plato, Ptolemy, etc. Instead of doing all that, we're going to take a fresh look at the world around us. We're going to observe, we're going to experiment, and then we're going to use our reason to understand our experiments. A good example of this is Newton, the apocryphal story where the apple falls on Newton's head. He doesn't say, well, Scripture says this, church tradition says this, Aristotle said this. He takes a fresh look and he begins to describe gravity, his laws of motion. And of course, that's not to say that Newton didn't believe in Scripture and in church tradition. In fact, he did. He had some very unique ideas on religion at the time, but he was very much a rationalist. He wanted to look at the world empirically and use his reason to sort all that out. And of course, this rationalism, when applied to government, the discipline of political science, which is the attempt to kind of look at politics and government in this rationalist way, observing nature, human nature, and then using our reason to try to understand those observations. When this begins to be applied to government, we get new types of government produced by revolutions. People begin to argue that inherent in nature are natural rights, and that government should respect these natural rights. And as a result of that, we get new forms of government, like representative democracy. And these ideas begin to spread throughout the world. And in many ways, we're still living with these principles as revolutions continue. Okay, so this lecture is going to be on the Enlightenment, otherwise known as the Age of Reason or the Age of Revolution. This is a lecture that I've had to put an extra amount of thought into. I've given this lecture many times, but with recent events in North County, in terms of the unrest there, some of this is very relevant, and I want to phrase everything and discuss everything in ways in which you, the student, can form your own perspective based upon your own values and experiences, by giving you knowledge, hopefully in an unbiased way, as much as possible. So it's taken me a significant amount of time to get around to recording this, just to make sure that I'm very careful about what I say, that this is helpful for each student during this period of time in which there's this period of unrest in the St. Louis County, and in light of the issues that are on everybody's minds at present. Okay, so we're talking about the Enlightenment. And in the Enlightenment, there are two big principles that we're going to discuss. Two aspects of the Enlightenment that are most important for our study, our examination. And one is that human beings begin to use reason in an attempt to understand observed experience. And they do this rather than appealing to traditional authorities. In the past, people would appeal to Scripture or to natural law, not natural law, or to church tradition in order to arrive at absolute truth. In this period, people will begin to trust the senses, the observations that come from the senses, and attempt to use reason in order to order and comprehend those observations. Secondly, because this is the observance of natural law in the minds of thinkers, there is an attempt to apply natural law, the laws of nature, to human political systems. And what results out of that philosophical movement is a period in which around the world many different peoples in North America, South America, and Europe particularly attempt to wrest power away from monarchs and systems of monarchy and to set up representative democracies in the form of republics. Another Enlightenment philosopher very important for our discussion was Voltaire. Voltaire was a Frenchman. He lived in absolutist France, in the most absolute, the model for absolutism in Western Europe. And Voltaire, in France, the Catholic Church and the French crown were very closely bound together. Again, you saw how earlier how the king Louis XIV had taken many of the powers of the church upon himself, that he ruled by divine right. If you slandered the king, it wasn't just slander or sedition, treason. It was also blasphemy, right? Because the king was God's chosen leader. And Voltaire rejected this idea. Voltaire rejected Christianity. He's one of the first, what we might use the term secularists. He believed that Christianity was superstition. He believed that it was barbaric, that the state used Christianity as its basis, its ideological basis for rule. He believed that politics and religion should be completely and utterly separate. He advocated for individual freedom of religion, and he believed in using reason alone to discern political truth. So we're not going to appeal to religion in any sense, according to Voltaire's point of view. And in France at the time, you have salons, basically these kind of coffee houses where people would get together and discuss political ideas. Many of these politicians had read, not politicians, these political thinkers, these gentlemen had read John Locke. Many of them, Voltaire was one of them, and they began to discuss these ideas, and many of these ideas were seditious. You could be jailed, found guilty of treason for arguing some of these principles, arguing some of these perspectives in France at the time. So it was very dangerous for these people to express themselves in this manner. Right? They were taking great risk upon themselves by arguing some of these ideas. In particular, one example in the U.S. is during the Continental Congress, when the statement was made that the states should hang together, and Benjamin Franklin made the famous statement, "Well, we will all hang together, or we will all hang separately," meaning that if the individual colonies didn't band together for independence, that the British Crown would capture all of those present and hang them for treason. Voltaire also made famous throughout Europe a court case called the Calas affair. And again, there are many instances in history where a court case kind of captivates society, and these differences of opinion regarding principle or political conditions or political conflicts are kind of symbolized by a particular trial. And this is the case with the Calas affair. When Louis XIV ripped up the Edict of Nantes, French Protestants lost the right to practice their religion in private. And the Protestant minority, particularly in the south of France, was, from Voltaire's point of view, was oppressed. People were denied their natural rights. Therefore, it was a sign of kind of the barbarity, the backwardness of the French crown. Well, in 1761, a French Protestant named Jean Calas found his son dead in his home. The son had actually committed suicide, but the family intended to make the suicide resemble a murder. And you think, well, why would you do that? At the time, if you committed suicide, it was a very serious ordeal for the family involved. If you committed suicide, the corpse would be taken to the courthouse, the corpse would be put on the stand, and the prosecuting attorney would actually read charges to the deceased corpse, finding the corpse guilty of homicide, and then the corpse would be taken and buried in a separate cemetery. This is something that Jean Calas wanted to avoid for his wife and relatives. So he made this suicide look like a murder, and those who had investigated the crime scene it was fairly evident that this whole murder had been doctored, and that his son had actually committed suicide. But the people in Bordeaux were very hostile to the Protestant minority there, and from Voltaire's point of view, a kind of kangaroo court was set up, in which there was this sham trial where Jean Calas was found guilty, despite there being no evidence of him murdering his son, and despite it being relatively clear that he had actually, that the son had actually committed suicide. But no matter, Jean Calas was sentenced to death, and Voltaire argued that this was because he was a Protestant. This is because of the prejudice of the court system in this part of France, and this was a testament of how backwards and how oppressive the French crown was. Jean Calas was sentenced to death in a very brutal way. He was broken on the wheel. This is what, if you look here at this picture of Jean Calas being executed, he's on what's called a St. Catherine's wheel. And how this works is the person is attached to this wheel, and every so often, and the wheel is turned, sometimes over a fire, sometimes not, but every so often the executioner will take a cudgel, basically a mallet, a hammer, and he will place the condemned person's arms or legs across the spokes, right, down to the side, place them across the spokes. And in the gaps between the spokes, because the spokes are actually bracing against the limb, the arm or the leg, there's in the middle, there's a lot of give. So the executioner will then take the cudgel and smash the bone in between the spokes to more easily break the arms and legs, right, in particular parts. And the condemned is actually left to die, right? And this can last a couple of days, right, before the person dies of shock or dehydration. It's an awful way to die. Sometimes the executioner, the crowd will appeal to the executioner's sense of mercy, and the executioner will then be allowed by the judge to administer what's called the coup de grace. Right, the executioner will then cut the throat of the condemned person so that they no longer suffer. And this kind of punishment, Voltaire argued that this was heinous. That not only was it heinous that Calas was sentenced to death because of his religious beliefs, it was heinous that he was killed in this barbaric, what he saw as kind of a medieval way to kill someone. And when the Founding Fathers described cruel and unusual punishment, this is what they were referencing, because this is the normative method of execution for commoners throughout Western Europe at this period of time. This was a very common way to execute murderers. And if you were a nobleman and you murdered someone, you could be shot or beheaded rather than being broken on the wheel. So there is a difference in punishment in terms of social class. But this is the cruel and unusual punishment that served as the frame of reference for cruel and unusual punishment in the 18th century. So Voltaire wrote a piece about this execution, and this piece spread throughout Europe. It was circulated throughout Europe, and people began to discuss these issues on a much wider scale. The final French philosopher we're going to look at is a man named Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau believed in this idea of a social contract. That was the basis of his thought, just as it was the basis of Locke and Hobbes. But Rousseau disagreed with Hobbes in that Rousseau believed that in a state of nature, we're good, right? We're just. That it's actually the government, it's actually giving away our freedom that corrupts us. So Rousseau argued that because we're good and just in a state of nature, we need a weak government. We need to be self-governing, right? We don't need to give our power away to the state. And so he argued in The Social Contract, which is a book he wrote, that the only legitimate social contract is one created by the people, i.e. the electorate, right? Because we're just and moral in a state of nature, we don't need a strong government dictating to us, telling us what we can and cannot do. In fact, we're just enough that we get to do that to the government, right? We get to decide what type of government governs us. Because we know a lot about in general, we're taught in high school, middle school about the American Revolution in the United States. I'd like to focus a little bit on the French Revolution. But with that said, I'd like for you to look at the videos, the video on the scandal in France over the NSA, the United States, spying on different European countries, or if you can recall the NSA spying scandal of recent history. It's important because the President of the United States was able to have information, had access to a great amount of information of intelligence regarding European governments. In fact, Angela Merkel, Chancellor of Germany, what she ate for dinner, right, was known to the NSA. So just take a second and look at that video. Okay, now I'd like for you to look at the video of John Adams meeting George III of England. John Adams is the first ambassador to England after, first ambassador to Great Britain after Great Britain had given the United States its independence. So take a look at that. You can see in that video the fear and trepidation experienced by Adams meeting this powerful monarch, meeting this very powerful world figure. And the reason I want you to look at those two videos back to back is that, you know, we're living in the United States of today. We're living in the world of today where our Constitution, our Declaration of Independence, these values, our thoughts on them, our perspective, we tend to take these ideas for granted, right? We tend to look at these ideas about individual freedom, right to private property, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, etc. We take that for granted, most of us, on a day-to-day basis, because these are the ideas that are at the core of our society. In this period of time, though, these are fringe ideas. These are very radical ideas for which you could be punished severely, even put to death for attempting to profess belief in these notions. So keep that in mind as we discuss the spread of these ideas throughout French society and eventually the toppling of the French monarchy. The French had a kind of legislative body called the Estates General. The Estates General had originally been the kind of like the Parliament in England in the Middle Ages. Had been kind of a body of nobility, members of the nobility who would kind of help the king rule and would give the king their consent regarding his decisions, because the nobles, while the king was the most powerful noble in the Middle Ages, these nobles also had their own castles and their own private armies, and so if the king wanted to get something done, in many instances he had to get his nobles on his own side. And powerful kings had to do this less than weaker kings. Well, in the age of absolutism, Louis XIV, he didn't call the Estates General. He didn't need their consent, right? He didn't need their help to rule. And over time, the Estates General began to include other members of society in addition to the nobility. Well, the Estates General came to consist of 3 estates. The first estate was the clergy of the Catholic Church, the clergy throughout the kingdom, the bishops and priests. The second estate consisted of the nobility, all the lords and ladies, and you can see the nobleman here by his military officer's attire and his sword. At the time, the only people allowed to serve as officers in the military were nobles. And in many other government positions, such as judges, magistrates, etc. in France, you had to be of noble blood to serve in these offices. And the third estate consisted of everyone else, everyone who wasn't a priest or a nobleman. So we're looking at about 90% of society making up the third estate. And each estate sent representatives to the Estates General based on numbers. So the number of there are X amount of nobles, so there will be X amount of representatives in the second estate. There are X amount of priests, so there will be X amount of representatives in the first estate. There are X amount of commoners and business people and craftsmen and farmers, etc. So there will be X amount of representatives for the third estate. So the third estate, the representatives of the third estate, vastly outnumbered the first 2 estates combined. But you would think that because they outnumbered everyone else, that the representatives of the third estate would then have power, have the bulk of the power. The majority of the population would have the majority of the power. That isn't the case, though, because instead of voting by head count, the Estates General would vote by estate. So the members of the third estate would vote, and then whatever their estate voted on, that would be 1 vote. The members of the second estate would vote. Whatever the nobles voted on, that would be another vote. And the members of the first estate would vote, and whatever the priests voted on, that would be 1 vote. So the first 2 estates could always collude and outvote the third estate. Right? So this body that represented the great mass of the population actually had very little power. But during the period of absolutism, the kings didn't even need to call the Estates General. It was kind of a defunct body. There were people who belonged to the Estates General, but they didn't need the consent of the Estates General to do anything. Well, that changed by the time of the reign of Louis XVI. His predecessor, Louis XV, had spent money frivolously. His ministers had tried to say, look, you know, this government is deeply in debt. This government is financially crashing. We need to do something. And he said, well, it will last during my time. After me, the deluge. Meaning, after me, everything can go to hell. I don't care. Right? And in fact, during the reign of his successor, Louis XVI, it did go to hell. Pardon my language. The government had aided the revolutionaries in the American Revolution. They didn't do this out of love for the principles held by the American colonists. In fact, the French crown abhorred these principles, and if you went around in Paris talking about life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, you would be jailed for sedition, treason. But in the previous generation, in the 1760s, the British had defeated the French and conquered the French colony of Quebec, the French part of Canada. Right? So the French had lost their North American empire to the British, so they wanted revenge. So they supported the rebels in the American Revolution. In fact, the French fleet was sent to prevent the British fleet from reinforcing the British troops, the British army of Lord Cornwallis, General Lord Cornwallis, at the Battle of Yorktown. So because the French fleet had blocked British ships from bringing supplies in, the British General Lord Cornwallis had no choice but to surrender to General George Washington after the siege of Yorktown, and this, of course, was a huge victory. This would bring about the end of the War of Independence. But this funneling guns to the rebels, sending in this French fleet, this had caused the French crown to incur a very, very large amount of debt. This and other obligations throughout the world. France was a world power at the time. It had colonies in the Caribbean. It had interests in Africa. So that this was the government was very heavily in debt. And of course, when the government was in debt, it did what many governments throughout history have done, which is always 100% of the time devastating, ruinous. In fact, this is something that helped bring the Roman Empire down. Many people don't realize it, but inflation is actually something that wrecked the Roman Empire, in my opinion, more than perhaps any other factor. That's an issue for another day. But the government began to print more money. Began to print more money in order to pay off its debts. And this is something, keep this period of time in France, keep that in mind when we talk about Germany in the 1920s and 30s. The Nazi Party, Adolf Hitler coming to power after inflation, hyperinflation, had basically destroyed the German economy. But the French crown began to print more money to pay these bills. And of course, this caused inflation. And this meant that the price of food, the price of all commodities began to go up. And of course, when bread is your staple food, when you're living off a pound of bread every day, right? And then the price of bread, the price of food is about half your income. Half your income is going to feeding your family. And the price of bread quadruples, right? You're suddenly faced with the prospect of starvation. And people, when they're faced with the prospect of starvation, become desperate, and they will do what they can to fight those circumstances. In addition to this hyperinflation wrecking the French economy, lowering the standard of living for the people in France, Enlightenment ideals began to spread. These ideals of Jean Locke, Voltaire, Rousseau, they began to spread throughout France. These coffee houses and salons, even ordinary people began to learn about these notions of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Once the American Revolution had succeeded in North America and the American colonists actually created an orderly government, that it didn't descend into chaos as many monarchists had argued it would in Europe. These ideas began to have new credibility. And so this climate of economic destruction, economic collapse, and these Enlightenment ideals, these forces began to converge, and we enter a period of revolution. This third estate broke away from the first two estates, and the reason that this happened is that Louis XVI had to call the Estates General. He had to call them back into existence. And remember, Louis XIV and XV, they had no use for the Estates General. He called them back into existence because he still needed to raise taxes to pay off these bills. And the third estate, recognizing the power they had, when the traditional meeting hall had been closed to them, they decided to break away and call themselves the National Assembly. And they stated that unless a constitution was established for the French people, for the Third Estate, they would not consent to passing any law whatsoever, including those laws by which the king would gain the taxes he needed to pay his bills, to pay the government's bills. And so they relocated to a nearby tennis court, and they put this into an oath called the Tennis Court Oath. And tennis, a very popular sport among aristocrats in this period of time. The king had initially resisted this kind of sit-in by the members of the Third Estate, now known as the National Assembly, who made the Tennis Court Oath. But his hand was forced after a riot in Paris in which a mob of desperate ordinary citizens stormed a prison called the Bastille and seized this prison. This isn't a prison in the sense of a penitentiary like we would know it today. It's basically a royal arsenal where there is a cache of gunpowder, of muskets, swords, etc. And it also has a dungeon in which political prisoners are held. Those who have been found guilty of sedition, who have distributed political pamphlets, who have written poetry condemning the king, who have been passing around the work of Voltaire, Thomas Jefferson, and others. And they're held, they're incarcerated there. So this mob seizes the prison. They arm themselves with muskets. They free these political prisoners, and then rather than have bloodshed, slaughter in the streets, the king accepts the demands of the members of the Third Estate. And of course, this creates a situation in which law and order begins to decline throughout France. The National Assembly then issues a declaration called the Declaration of the Rights of Man. And though this isn't a formal constitution, it kind of serves the purpose of a formal constitution, in which the privileges of the nobility were revoked, the state tithed to the church, the Kingdom of France, because it was arm in arm with the church. The kingdom actually paid a tithe to the church for the nation, so that the ordinary people did not pay their tithe. The church was supported by the state. This was done away with the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Individuals would then have to pay their tithe if they so chose. And the king was not dethroned, but he lost a lot of his power, particularly legislative power. The National Assembly began to argue that it alone could make laws, kind of in the way that the United States Congress does. And of course, if you look up at the top of this image, you can see this pyramid with an eye on it. This is a Masonic symbol, and you could look at the E pluribus unum from Mini 1 on the money of the United States, and again, you'll find this Masonic symbol. The reason for this is that in many areas of Europe, these Masonic lodges, because they were secretive, they were environments where you could actively discuss these principles, these Enlightenment principles. So that's why many of the Founding Fathers and the French philosophers, many of them were Masons, because they could freely discuss these ideas without the threat of persecution by the state in these Masonic lodges. And of course, there are all sorts of conspiracy theories coming out of this, but the reality is that in this period of time, these Masonic ideals were actually the ideals of the Enlightenment, and the Masonic lodges were just kind of safe houses for some of these philosophers. In the National Assembly, factions arose. Those of like-minded beliefs tended to congregate. Those who were of the right wing, those who wanted to retain the monarchy, who they didn't want to give the king his power back, but they wanted to keep him as a symbol of the state and the nation. They sat on the right wing. As you move to the left of the assembly, those who sat on the extreme end of the left side of the assembly, the left wing, they wanted to abolish the monarchy and form a republic. And of course, this is the origin of these terms, right wing and left wing. This is where these terms come into being. The French press talking about what those on the right wing had to say today versus those on the left wing. Many foreign powers felt threatened by the success of the French Revolution. There was this idea that if the revolutionaries could rise up, the people could rise up and threaten the power of their monarch in France, well, they could do it in Prussia. They could do it in Austria. They could do it in Russia. They could do it in Spain. So many foreign powers were very much threatened that these revolutionary ideals, which were already spreading throughout their domains, that they might prompt a revolution in their own territories. In addition to this, the Queen of France, who we'll talk more about in just a moment, Marie Antoinette, she was a member of the Austrian royal family. Now, Austria is a country southeast of Germany. The Austrians are ethnically German. They speak German. They speak the German language. And in this period of time, they had built up, in the preceding centuries, a very large empire. The Habsburg Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire in a later period. Remember that when we're talking about the First World War. But the Austrians were kind of the rival superpower with the French. Right? The French and Austrians had fought during the reign of Louis XIV, and they were kind of blood enemies. Right? They were very intense rivals. Well, as part of a peace treaty between France and Austria, Louis XVI had married a member of the Austrian royal family, Marie Antoinette. And so many of the people hated Marie Antoinette. She was very unpopular. She was seen as kind of a hated enemy. In fact, one of the very first events of mass unrest during the French Revolution was when a large number of women from Paris actually marched to Versailles to talk to the king, to tell the king. The king was kind of seen as the protector of women throughout the realm, so they went to the king to ask him why, what are you going to do about the fact that we can't feed our children, we can't feed our husbands, etc. And so, as they were marching, they chanted slogans against Marie Antoinette, because many of these women believed that Marie Antoinette was this kind of temptress. She was this devil who had taken control of the king and had prevented him from helping the people, which is what he wanted to do. He was just ensnared by this foreign evil woman. And the fact that she seemed to be, she wasn't French, so obviously she was very out of touch with the French people. When the French people were starving, the statement she made, "Let them eat cake," meaning she actually didn't have any ill intent when she made this statement. The French term is brioche, which is kind of a bread-like cake, but we use the term cake in English. But she didn't say it didn't have the meaning that it would later come to have. Right? She actually wondered, well, if there's no bread to eat, why not just eat cake? Right? She had never known anything but abundance, but luxury and wealth. So she couldn't conceive of starvation. And of course, the peasants saw that as complete dismissal of their concerns, really of their lives. So she was doubly hated after that. Well, to make matters worse, Louis XVI had decided to flee with his queen, Marie Antoinette, to what's now Belgium. Well, Belgium at this period of time was known as the Austrian Netherlands. That period, that region of the Netherlands was actually ruled by the Austrian royal family. So Louis was wanting to flee to the Netherlands to meet up with his wife's family, the royal family of the Habsburgs, the royal family of the Austrian Empire, so that they could then march an army into France and crush this mass revolt. Louis left. He kept a very, very detailed diary, wrote in it every day, and he wasn't a very intelligent man in a sense, and he left this diary open on his desk after he fled. So obviously his handlers knew exactly where he was going and what he was doing, and he ended up being stopped at the border by a soldier who had recognized his picture from a coin. And he was taken back to Paris and placed under house arrest. And of course the people were furious. They were particularly furious at Marie Antoinette, that she had, in their mind, she had deceived Louis into attempting to flee and to actually collude with these hated foreigners to end their revolution, to crush their rights. Okay, so this method of execution, this device we're looking at here, is called a guillotine. It was invented by a Dr. Guillotin, and it was intended to replace the St. Catherine's wheel. This was considered to be a more humane form of execution. In my opinion, it is more humane than the St. Catherine's wheel, even though it doesn't seem humane to us today. But you know, that's form your own opinion whether you think this is more humane than a lethal injection or otherwise. This was considered a more egalitarian form of execution. So all classes of people would be executed if they were found guilty of a capital crime. They would be executed on the guillotine instead of, for example, nobles being beheaded and commoners being broken on the wheel. Everyone would be killed very quickly in this swift egalitarian form of execution if they were found guilty of a crime. And of course this is very important for what would come later. King and Queen were executed in 1793 after the King and Queen were stopped attempting to flee the country and collude with a foreign power to crush the revolution. Again, Marie Antoinette was a member of the Austrian royal family, so her relatives were incensed over her being executed. They were outraged over this, and so they declared war immediately and waged war against the new French Republic. And because the Austrians, the Spanish, the Prussians, they're waging war against this French Republic, there's war on all sides. Paranoia over this these foreign invasions rather, led to the development of a police state. Order broke down very quickly. And because people were fearful that these foreign countries would come in and put a king back on the throne and threaten their freedoms, ironically enough, they allowed the Republican government, members of the National Assembly, they allowed that government even greater powers. A man named Robespierre headed a party called the Jacobin Party. And this was a very radical party. The Jacobin Party wanted to remove the Catholic Church from being a prominent, an influential part of society. They wanted to change the calendar to restart at the year 0 in order to make a completely new history for humanity. They also attempted to push something called the cult of reason, where you would go into these temples of reason where there would be statues of kind of these Roman goddesses symbolizing logic. And the Jacobins had advocated for the execution of Louis XVI, and this man here, Robespierre, was very radical against the monarchy, very radical as a revolutionary. He administered this police state based on a need for internal security. And in the process, he executed up to around 40,000 French men and women for treason. And most of these, the vast majority of them, Robespierre did basically wipe out every member of the aristocracy, every man, woman, and child who couldn't manage to escape France. He did murder thousands of aristocrats, but the vast majority of the people he had sent to the guillotine were ordinary men and women who, in this climate of paranoia, maybe had said something, maybe had done something that had caused them to be suspect, or maybe someone didn't like them and therefore kind of trumped up charges by which accusing them of going against the revolution, or of trying to undermine the revolution, or of working with a foreign power, etc. So a large number of people, 40,000, were killed by Robespierre and his government. And we call this period the Reign of Terror, where Robespierre and terror reigned. This fear of being next, the fear of being accused next and being executed. It's very similar to kind of the witch hunts we talked about in other classes where we covered the Protestant Reformation, Catholic Counter-Reformation, all of these witch trials, etc. This is kind of a similar dynamic. Well, Robespierre had actually accused a member of the National Assembly of opposing the revolution. I just stuck my elbow into this fan here. It doesn't have a front cover on it because it's very old, so got a little bit of a shock there. But Robespierre actually was guillotined after the National Assembly turned against him. After Robespierre's Jacobin party fell from power, people were kind of tired of the radicals. They were tired of what they viewed as extremism in government. They wanted someone who could provide security, not just security from foreign powers, but also peace, social peace. And there was a young man named Napoleon Bonaparte. He was from an island in the Mediterranean called Corsica, which was ruled by the French crown previously, then ruled by the French Republic. But Corsicans, actually, they're ethnically Italian. Napoleon Bonaparte was ethnically an Italian. He spoke Italian as his first language. At the age of 12, he had been admitted to the French Military Academy, Royal Military Academy. He had graduated as an artillery officer at the age of 16. He was an absolute genius, meaning that in every sense of the word. Some have argued that his IQ may have approached that of Albert Einstein. He was a mathematical genius. He could do very complex math in his head at a moment's notice, and this helped him as an artillery officer because he could calculate the trajectory of a cannonball in a split second. And of course this made him very effective on the battlefield as these foreign armies were mowed down by the cannon under his command. And of course he rose through the ranks because of this. And he was able to look at a battlefield and instantaneously determine the most advantageous disposition of troops, who to move, where, etc. So he became a general, and then he began to win victories against France's enemies. He began to defeat the Austrians in Italy, and after this happened, he was seen as kind of the savior of the country. Remember, people are terrified of foreign invasion, and then here comes Napoleon defeating all these foreigners right and left. And so he cleverly began to use the newspaper propaganda in addition to his battlefield victories to develop to grow in stature. In 1799, he named himself a consul. This is the name of an office in the Roman Republic as kind of the chief executive official. This is what he named himself. And you can see here in this picture how he has his hand inside the buttons of his shirt. This is just a personal tic he had. This is a personal habit, idiosyncrasy of Napoleon. If you notice that in the American Civil War, you look at pictures of men like George McClellan, Stonewall Jackson, others, you'll notice that these, on both sides, the generals tend to put their hands inside their jackets in the way Napoleon's doing it. They're doing this in imitation and as an homage to Napoleon. Napoleon at the time was considered the greatest general of all time. Many historians consider him the greatest general of all time today. So he had shaped military tactics, military strategy for the 19th century, and they were educated at West Point in Napoleonic tactics. So they imitated Napoleon in their pictures. Well, Napoleon had managed to quiet disturbances inside France. The people who took power directly after the Jacobins fell from power were called the Directorate, and when they couldn't quell rioting, Napoleon brought his troops into Paris and other areas of France and crushed these what he saw as insurrections and took power. In 1802, he named himself Emperor of France. So, ironically, at the end of this revolutionary struggle, the French people killed their king, set up a republic, and then that republic eventually crowned an emperor. A strange turn of events. But again, Napoleon was a genius, and he was especially a military genius. Napoleon defeated every army in Europe. He would consistently win battles against Austria, Prussia, and Russia. At the Battle of Austerlitz, I think, which is in 1806, if I'm not mistaken, he defeated the combined armies of Austria, Prussia, and Russia at once. Okay, so he was basically invulnerable on the battlefield. He ended up putting his brother on the throne, I believe it's Spain and Italy. He gave his brothers and other relatives noble titles. He brought much of continental Europe, the vast majority of it, under his control. He refused to dethrone the Pope after the conquest of Italy. He ended up actually drafting an accord with the Vatican, restoring some of the lands taken from the church after the Revolution. And of course, this was done to kind of stabilize conflict within France. Many of the French people had begun to reject the Revolution because the radical Jacobins had attacked the Catholic Church. Even though they had maybe felt that the church was too powerful, that the church shouldn't be linked to the state, they still had faith in Catholic Christianity, particularly in the countryside. So people began to fight against the government, and civil war had developed alongside these foreign invasions. Napoleon ended all of this conflict for good by drafting an accord with the Pope. Napoleon destroyed many traditional monarchies, such as the Holy Roman Empire, which was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. That's what he said after he ended it, after he dethroned the last emperor. And of course, Napoleon was very witty. He kind of he janked people after taking their thrones from them, if I can use that word. And it's actually very entertaining to read, but also kind of menacing in a way, how callous Napoleon could be. He seized territories belonging to bishops. Before Napoleon's reign, bishops would rule entire counties, right? They would have claim to rule over certain territories. Napoleon ended this. And in areas like Germany, where there had been so many small independent states, Napoleon had crushed all of them. So after Napoleon's defeat, it would be easier for different states in Germany and Italy to begin to consolidate power and grow larger. So it was a way for nationalism and unification to actually occur, indirectly caused by Napoleon's policies, by his victories. Well, Napoleon had issued what he called the Continental Policy. Great Britain had remained his enemy. Britain and France had been enemies since the 100 Years' War, at the end of the Middle Ages. They were kind of seemingly eternal rivals. Well, Napoleon had built a navy that had been crushed by a British admiral named Horatio Nelson at the Battle of Trafalgar, thus the name of Trafalgar Square in London, in homage of this battle. Napoleon had built this navy, even though the French, even though he wasn't particularly knowledgeable about naval warfare. The idea was that the French army would be able to cross into Britain, and if the French army had made it into Britain, Great Britain would not have survived. They could not muster an army of the size and quality of the French Empire under Napoleon. But at the same time, they had the best navy in the world, and they were able to destroy the French fleet and prevent an invasion of their home islands, of Britain and Ireland. To punish the British, to crush Britain, he attempted to starve the British out by closing continental ports to British merchants, that this would financially ruin Britain. Well, the Russian Tsar, he still traded with Britain, and this angered Napoleon. Napoleon wanted to invade Russia and punish the Tsar and make him give up this policy of trading with Great Britain. And when Napoleon invaded Russia, the Russians employed a scorched earth, not a scorched earth, a scorched earth. We'll use the term scorched earth policy strategy, in which they would burn their own farms, they would burn their own towns, villages, and retreat further to the east into this great mass of Russian territory, the hinterland. And of course, when Napoleon's army would march through Russia, they would march unopposed. They would not find significant resistance in the form of an enemy army. But also, the land was ruined, so they couldn't forage for food, they couldn't find any livestock, and of course Napoleon's supply lines were stretched thin. As they moved, they basically ended up moving through this giant frozen wasteland once the winter came, and Napoleon's soldiers began to die of hypothermia and of disease at an alarming rate. And basically, he had no choice but to retreat from Russia, and during the retreat, he was harassed by Russian guerrillas, and many more died of disease and starvation on the way. He ultimately he made it to France with 1/10 of the number of troops he left with. He made it back with 50,000. He left with 500,000. He ended up being exiled to the island of Elba, but he actually was able to, he crafted an escape plan. It worked. He made it back to France. He again appeared in Paris, raised a huge army, and was ultimately defeated again at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. He was then exiled to the South Atlantic island of St. Helena, thousands of miles away from France, so he could never make it back to France. And there the British were still so fearful of Napoleon, the idea of him returning to power, that he was actually, we know now for a fact by looking at his remains, doing a recent autopsy, that he was in fact poisoned with arsenic by his British handlers. After the defeat of Napoleon, the victorious Allied powers, Austria, Prussia, Russia, Great Britain, they held a summit called the Congress of Vienna in order to determine what to do in the wake of Napoleon's defeat. Napoleon had destroyed all of these traditional monarchies, and they wanted to find a political solution to this power vacuum. And you can see standing in the white breeches in front of this red chair, this is a man named Metternich. He is an Austrian diplomat. He is kind of the leader of this summit, the Congress of Vienna. And again, it's being held in Vienna, Austria being the preeminent superpower next to France at the time. France has been defeated. Austria is triumphant. And in this Congress of Vienna, This was primarily conservative politicians, not conservative in the sense that we use the term today, conservative in the sense of favoring monarchy, of favoring a confessional state, meaning that the state and church are united, that there's an official state religion subsidized by the state. Bringing the nobility back into power, kind of crushing these revolutionary ideals, doing away with constitutional rule. This was the prerogative of these victors over Napoleon, and you can see that in their dress. It's reflected in their dress. You can see these breeches here called culottes. These are stockings that go up to the knee, and this is a sign of nobility. Noblemen wore these because they didn't have to engage in manual labor. It was a sign of their status. If you were a manual laborer, if you were a farmer or a craftsman, and you attempted to wear these breeches, they would be ruined immediately. Right? In fact, a derogatory term for the members of the Third Estate in French at the time, before the Revolution, was sans culotte, which just means without breeches, right? Without stockings. Meaning that these lower class people wore long pants to protect their legs during their hard work. So these men are from the aristocracy. They're they're very anti-revolutionary in their ideals. So they try to bring the House of Bourbon, the House of Louis XVI, they bring that house back to power in France. They put a king back on the throne. They put kings back on the throne in all of the countries that Napoleon had taken over. And they managed to condemn the slave trade, that being the only Enlightenment ideal that they had passed. But the cat was already out of the bag, despite the fact that they had attempted to put monarchies back in place in Europe. These revolutionary ideals had spread, and once they had begun to spread, it was only a matter of time before those monarchies would be overthrown themselves. And that's the subject for another lecture. So, again, those two principles that we talked about at the very beginning, the use of experiment, observation, and reason to understand nature, and then applying that knowledge to government, to develop these revolutionary ideals, representative democracy. And of course, we know that this was very, very, very chaotic when this began to emerge in Europe. Unlike in the United States was surrounded by, on one side, by ocean, by a huge ocean that protected it from foreign powers. There was a vast wilderness on its western border, and of course this wilderness was inhabited by indigenous groups, but they did not have the power to actually crush the nascent republic. Whereas the French Republic was surrounded by foreign powers of more or less equal power when they all kind of colluded together. So the French Republic was threatened at the beginning in a way that the American Republic was not. And so with the American Republic, we see kind of a gradual development. There's a constitution. Well, first there's the Articles of Confederation. Then when that begins to show strain, there's a constitution, and these issues are gradually worked out in a legislative process until the American Civil War. Whereas the French situation was much more perilous. The French were having to work all these issues out at once. Okay, if there are any questions about anything, let me know. And thanks for watching this.